23 June 1941, 04:15 a.m. The forests of Lithuania are already scarred by fire when German panzer columns roll eastward, engines rumbling with the confidence of an army that has conquered Poland, smashed France, and driven the British from the continent. Operation Barbarossa is barely 48 hours old. Luftwaffe aircraft dominate the sky. Infantry advances behind armor that has proven itself unbeatable in the campaigns of 1939 and 1940. German officers expect the same result here: rapid collapse, encirclement, annihilation. Then, on a narrow road near the Dubisa River, that confidence comes to an abrupt halt. Ahead of the advancing tanks stands something unfamiliar, low, massive, angular, and unmoving. At first, German crews assume it is another obsolete Soviet vehicle, the kind intelligence reports have dismissed as poorly armored and badly crewed. Orders are given to engage. Panzer III and Panzer 38T guns open fire at close range. Shells strike steel and bounce away. What follows over the next several days will shock the German army, force emergency changes in tactics, and permanently alter how armored warfare is understood on the Eastern Front. A tank Germany laughed it will survive direct hits, crush dozens of German vehicles, halt entire formations, and expose a dangerous truth: Blitzkrieg has limits, and those limits are made of steel. The tank is the Soviet KV-1. In June 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union represents the largest military operation in history. Nearly 4 million Axis troops surge forward along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German strategy relies on speed, rapid armored thrusts to encircle Soviet forces before they can retreat or reorganize. It has worked everywhere else. Soviet armored forces are expected to collapse under coordinated air attacks and fast-moving panzer divisions. But the Red Army that the Germans meet is not entirely what they expect. Though badly led, partially mobilized, and suffering from the aftershocks of Stalin's purges, the Soviet Union possesses something the Germans have not yet faced: heavily armored breakthrough tanks designed not for maneuver warfare, but for survival under direct fire. Among them is the Kliment Voroshilov tank, known simply as the KV. Designed in the late 1930s after Soviet observers studied the brutality of mechanized warfare in Spain, the KV-1 rejects the prevailing European philosophy of speed over protection. Instead, it embraces armor, thick, sloped, and nearly impervious to the anti-tank weapons of its time. Its frontal armor can reach 75 millimeters. Its sides are stronger than the front plates of most German tanks. It carries a 76.2 gun capable of destroying any panzer then in service. On paper, the KV-1 is slow, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to maintain. German intelligence dismisses it as impractical. German crews laugh when they first hear reports of a heavy Russian tank that crawls across the battlefield. They stop laughing when their shells fail to penetrate it. Near Razyny, elements of the German 6th Panzer Division encounter KV tanks operating independently and in small groups. Communication is chaotic. Soviet units are often cut off, fighting without orders, fuel, or resupply. Yet this chaos produces something dangerous: tanks that do not retreat, do not reposition, and do not disengage. They stand their ground and fight until destroyed or until the enemy breaks contact. One KV-1 rolls into a key road junction astride German supply lines. For hours, then days, it blocks movement entirely. German infantry assaults fail. Anti-tank guns are destroyed at point-blank range. Panzer crews maneuver desperately to find weak points that do not exist. Even rear shots at close distance fail to penetrate. German reports from the sector describe scenes that defy prior experience. Panzer shells leave only dents. Crews abandon vehicles under fire they cannot return effectively. Entire columns are forced to halt while engineers attempt to bring up heavier weapons. Time, Blitzkrieg's most valuable asset, is lost. Elsewhere along the front, similar encounters unfold. KV-1s appear suddenly, absorb punishment that would obliterate lighter tanks, and return fire with devastating effect. German Panzer III and IV units suffer losses not through tactical error but technological shock. In a matter of days, dozens of German tanks and anti-tank guns are destroyed by KV crews who often fight isolated, surrounded, and without coordination. The psychological impact is immediate. German commanders begin issuing emergency instructions. avoid engagement, call artillery, use 88 anti-aircraft guns in a ground roll, aim for tracks, exhaust all ammunition if necessary. None of this fits the doctrine that has carried them from the Ardennes to the English Channel. The Eastern Front is supposed to be about speed. Instead, it is becoming about survival. Behind these battlefield moments lies a deeper strategic miscalculation. German planners have underestimated not just Soviet numbers, but Soviet industrial philosophy. The KV-1 is not elegant, it is not efficient, but it is brutally effective in the one role it was designed for, breaking enemy advances and surviving long enough to matter. As reports of these engagements filter upward, disbelief turns to concern. If tanks like this exist in significant numbers, and if heavier variants follow, then the assumptions underlying Barbarossa are dangerously flawed. The laughter fades, the jokes stop, the war in the East begins to feel different from anything Germany has fought before. And as burning Panzer wrecks dot the Lithuanian countryside, the realization settles in that the Soviet Union, for all its chaos and contradictions, has unleashed a machine that cannot be ignored. A tank that does not need speed to win, only endurance, firepower, and the time it steals from an enemy who never planned to lose it. The confrontation between German doctrine and Soviet steel has only begun, and in the days ahead, the KV-1 will force the Wehrmacht to confront a reality it never intended to face, as the momentum of invasion slows under the weight of armor that refuses to break. By the summer of 1941, German armored doctrine has been refined through experience rather than theory. Blitzkrieg is not merely speed, it is coordination, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power moving in tight harmony to unbalance and collapse an enemy before resistance can solidify. In Poland and France, this system has worked because German armor has faced opponents whose tanks could be destroyed by standard anti-tank guns, whose command structures fractured under pressure, and whose air forces were neutralized early. Against the Soviet Union, that equation is already proving unstable. The KV-1 does not fit into the categories German planners are used to. It is neither a fast exploitation tank nor a lightly armored infantry support vehicle. It is something else entirely, a mobile fortress designed to absorb punishment and continue fighting even when isolated. Its appearance on the battlefield disrupts not just tactics, but tempo. Every KV encountered demands disproportionate attention: heavy guns, artillery, engineers, air support, resources that slow the advance and pull units off schedule. At Razyni, the most famous of these early encounters unfolds not as a single dramatic duel, but as a grinding test of endurance. A KV-1, likely separated from its unit during the chaos of the opening invasion, positions itself astride a supply route vital to the German 6th Panzer Division. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and repair vehicles are forced to stop or turn back. Without fuel, German tanks cannot advance. Without ammunition, they cannot fight. Without repair units, damaged vehicles become permanent losses. The KV's crew, whose names remain uncertain in surviving records, fight with a clarity of purpose that requires no orders. They fire deliberately, conserving ammunition. German attempts to approach are met with sudden, accurate gunfire. Anti-tank teams crawling forward with explosives are cut down by machine gun bursts. Field guns brought up under cover of smoke are destroyed before they can be repositioned. For nearly 2 days, the KV holds its ground. German engineers eventually bring up an 88 Mfl-K gun, a weapon designed for high-altitude air defense but increasingly pressed into service against heavy armor. Under cover of darkness and diversionary fire, they maneuver it into position. At close range, the gun fires armor-piercing rounds directly into the KV's side. Even then, the first shots do not immediately destroy it. Only after repeated hits does the tank finally fall silent. When German troops approach, they find evidence of the struggle written into the steel itself. Dozens of impact marks, gouges, and dents across the hull. The KV is not destroyed because it was outmatched in combat, but because the Germans were forced to bring the only weapon available that could reliably kill it. This pattern repeats across the front. The Red Army's armored forces are in organizational terms in disarray. Many KV units suffer from mechanical failures, poor logistics, and inexperienced crews. Fuel shortages strand tanks far from friendly lines. Ammunition runs out. Radios are scarce or unreliable. And yet, wherever a KV reaches the battlefield intact, it exerts an influence far beyond its numbers. German after-action reports begin to note the problem explicitly. Standard 37 anti-tank guns, the backbone of German infantry defense, are declared ineffective. Crews nickname them door knockers, weapons that announce their presence without causing damage. Even the 15 guns mounted on upgraded Panzer III tanks struggle except at dangerously close range. This forces German units to improvise. Tanks maneuver to fire at tracks, attempting to immobilize KVs rather than destroy them. Artillery units are ordered forward into exposed positions. Luftwaffe pilots are tasked with low-altitude attacks against individual tanks, missions that increase losses and consume time better spent supporting breakthroughs. The irony is stark. German doctrine emphasizes avoiding attritional fights, yet the KV-1 imposes exactly that kind of engagement. Every minute spent dealing with one tank is a minute not spent encircling Soviet armies. Every heavy gun diverted to kill a KV is a gun not supporting the main advance. Behind the scenes, this tactical shock begins to ripple upward. Reports reach Army Group commanders. Technical intelligence units are dispatched to examine knocked-out KVs. Armor thickness measurements are taken. Gun calibers are compared. The conclusions are unsettling. Germany has no tank in service that can reliably match this vehicle head-on. The Panzer IV, armed with a short-barreled 75mm gun optimized for high-explosive rounds, lacks sufficient penetration. The Panzer III, designed as the main battle tank, is undergunned and under-armored. Planned upgrades suddenly feel inadequate. If the Soviets can field tanks like this now, what will they field in a year, in two? The KV-1, however, is not invincible. Its weight strains its transmission. Its crew visibility is poor. Coordination with infantry is inconsistent. But these weaknesses do not matter in the opening weeks of Barbarossa, when chaos reigns and isolated engagements decide local outcomes. In those moments, survivability outweighs elegance. Soviet industry, meanwhile, is already preparing for a war of endurance. Even as factories in the Western USSR face evacuation under German air attack, production plans emphasize simplicity and mass. The KV is expensive, slow to build, and resource-intensive, but it serves as a bridge, buying time while more adaptable designs are refined. German commanders do not yet know it, but the KV-1 is not the end of this evolution. It is the warning shot. As July turns to August, the German advance continues, but it is no longer effortless. Supply lines stretch, casualties mount, mechanical wear increases. And in scattered fields and forest roads, burned-out Panzer hulks bear witness to encounters that were never supposed to happen, encounters with a tank that refused to die, and in doing so forced an army built on momentum to stop, think, and bleed. And as the Wehrmacht pushes deeper into Soviet territory, the shadow cast by the KV-1 grows longer, foreshadowing a future in which German armor will no longer dominate the battlefield unchallenged. By mid-1941, the German army is learning its lessons the hard way. The early weeks of Barbarossa still yield massive encirclements, captured cities, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners, but beneath those strategic successes lies a growing unease. The advance is slower than planned, losses are higher than expected, and increasingly the cause is not Soviet numbers but Soviet machines that refuse to conform to German expectations. The KV-1 forces a re-evaluation of how armor is employed and how it is destroyed. German field commanders begin issuing ad hoc guidance. Tank units are warned not to engage heavy Soviet tanks frontally unless absolutely necessary. Infantry units are instructed to identify and mark KV positions for artillery. Engineers are tasked with creating improvised obstacles, ditches, mines, roadblocks to channel or immobilize these vehicles. The emphasis shifts from destruction to neutralization, an admission that the enemy cannot always be killed quickly. This shift has consequences. German units trained to operate fluidly now find themselves tied down by singular threats. A lone KV can pin an entire battalion, forcing defensive postures in the middle of an offensive campaign. Time and coordination suffer, and in modern mechanized warfare, time is often decisive. The German solution increasingly relies on the 88 Mfla-K gun. Originally developed to counter high-altitude bombers, the weapon possesses the velocity and penetration required to defeat heavy armor. Crews begin to specialize in anti-tank ambushes, concealing their guns until Soviet tanks approach within lethal range. This tactic works, but it is resource-intensive and dangerous. FLA-K units are not designed to operate under direct ground fire, and losses mount when positions are discovered. Even when KVs are destroyed, they extract a price. German reports frequently note that heavy guns must fire multiple rounds at close range to achieve a kill. Ammunition stocks are depleted faster than anticipated. Guns overheat, crews are exhausted. Each engagement becomes a miniature battle rather than a fleeting exchange. For the Red Army, the KV-1's impact is uneven but significant. Soviet command and control in 1941 is fragile. Many tank units lack effective coordination with infantry or artillery. Orders are delayed or contradictory. Yet where KV crews operate with initiative, they achieve results disproportionate to their numbers. They block roads, disrupt supply lines, and force German commanders to divert forces at critical moments. In some cases, KV units are used as mobile strongpoints, anchoring defensive lines while lighter tanks and infantry reposition. In others, they operate independently, striking German columns from unexpected directions before withdrawing or fighting to destruction. These actions do not halt the invasion, but they slow it, and slowing the invasion is, at this stage, a strategic victory. The human dimension of these encounters is often obscured by the focus on machinery, but it is central to the story. KV crews operate under extreme conditions. Inside the tank, heat builds rapidly. Visibility is limited to narrow slits and periscopes. Communication between crew members relies on shouted commands over engine noise. When shells strike the hull, the impact reverberates through the interior, showering the crew with flakes of metal and paint. Even non-penetrating hits can injure or disorient. Despite this, many crews continue to fight until ammunition is gone or the tank is immobilized. German soldiers encountering destroyed KVs frequently note the presence of fallen crew members still at their stations, evidence of resistance maintained to the last possible moment. These observations, recorded in after-action reports rather than memoir embellishments, contribute to a grudging respect that replaces early mockery. From an industrial standpoint, the KV-1 exposes divergent philosophies. German tank design emphasizes balance, mobility, firepower, and protection optimized together. Soviet design, at least in this case, prioritizes survivability above all else. The result is a vehicle that is difficult to produce and maintain, but extraordinarily difficult to kill. This contrast begins to shape future German decisions. Engineers accelerate work on heavier tanks and more powerful guns. The need for a weapon capable of defeating Soviet armor at range becomes urgent. Projects previously considered unnecessary or impractical gain new momentum. The seeds of Germany's heavy tank program, vehicles that will later dominate battlefields in different ways, are planted in these early encounters with the KV. Yet for all its influence, the KV-1 is not a war-winning weapon on its own. Its numbers are limited. Mechanical failures claim many vehicles before they ever meet the enemy. Logistics remain a persistent challenge for Soviet forces, especially as factories are relocated eastward under the pressure of invasion. But war is not decided solely by perfect machines or flawless doctrine. It is shaped by friction, adaptation, and the cumulative effect of small disruptions. The KV-1 represents exactly that kind of disruption, a flaw introduced into the German operational system that cannot be easily corrected. As summer deepens and the fighting moves towards Smolensk and beyond, German armor continues to advance, but it does so with caution learned through experience. Every forest edge, every village, every crossroads now carries the possibility of encountering a tank that cannot be quickly destroyed. The laughter of June is gone, replaced by a professional wariness. And in the workshops and design offices of both sides, the lessons of 1941 are being absorbed, setting the stage for an armored contest that will only grow more brutal as the war grinds on. By the autumn of 1941, the influence of the KV-1 is no longer confined to isolated battlefield reports. It has become a factor in operational planning, an unwelcome variable that German commanders must account for even when no KV is present. The mere possibility of encountering one alters movement, spacing, and tempo. Columns advance more cautiously. Reconnaissance is emphasized. Heavy guns are kept closer to the front than doctrine once advised. This is not how Blitzkrieg is supposed to function. The German invasion timetable, built on assumptions of rapid Soviet collapse, begins to slip. Weather, distance, and resistance all play their roles, but armored friction is a constant undercurrent. The KV-1 does not win battles alone, yet it consumes time in a war where time is everything. Each day lost in summer and autumn is a day not recovered before winter. For the Red Army, the experience of 1941 is catastrophic and instructive in equal measure. Entire armored formations are destroyed or scattered. Command structures disintegrate under pressure. Yet amid the wreckage, patterns emerge. Soviet analysts observe that KV tanks, when used defensively or in terrain that restricts maneuver, perform far better than expected. Forest roads, river crossings, urban approaches, these environments amplify the KV's strengths and reduce its weaknesses. This realization begins to shape how the tank is employed. Instead of massed maneuvers that strain unreliable transmissions, KVs are increasingly assigned to key defensive sectors. They are used to block axes of advance, support counterattacks, and anchor infantry positions. In these roles, their slow speed matters less than their ability to absorb fire and keep fighting. German units encountering such defenses find themselves drawn into costly engagements that yield little ground. The Germans respond with adaptation of their own. New ammunition types are rushed to the front. Improved armor-piercing rounds increase the effectiveness of existing guns, though still not reliably against KV frontal armor. Tactical coordination between tanks, artillery, and air support improves. The 88mm gun becomes a symbol of necessity rather than improvisation, its crews trained explicitly for anti-tank warfare. But adaptation takes time, and time favors the defender. As the front stretches deeper into the Soviet Union, supply lines grow fragile. Fuel shortages become more frequent, spare parts are harder to obtain, vehicles break down faster than they can be repaired. In this environment, the KV-1's impact is magnified. A single immobilized German column can delay operations across an entire sector. A single heavy tank can force rerouting that ripples outward for miles. The winter of 1941–1942 brings a temporary halt to large-scale armored operations, but it does not diminish the KV's significance. In freezing temperatures, mechanical reliability becomes a universal problem. German tanks suffer as much as Soviet ones, sometimes more. The KV's thick armor, once a liability in mobility, offers protection against cold and small arms fire in defensive fighting around Moscow and Leningrad. By this stage, German respect for the KV is institutionalized. Training manuals are updated. Intelligence briefings include detailed sections on Soviet heavy tanks. New recruits are warned explicitly, do not underestimate Russian armor. Yet the KV-1's greatest legacy is not what it does in 1941, but what it compels both sides to do afterward. For Germany, it accelerates the pursuit of heavier tanks and more powerful guns. Designs that once seemed excessive are now justified by battlefield necessity. Armor thickness increases, gun calibers grow, the philosophical balance of German tank design shifts, moving away from pure maneuver toward survivability and firepower. For the Soviet Union, the KV experience informs a different path. Engineers recognize the value of heavy armor but also its cost. Production complexity, maintenance demands, and mobility limitations all factor into future designs. The solution is not to abandon heavy tanks, but to refine their role, and to complement them with a new generation of medium tanks that blend protection, firepower, and mass production. The armored war on the Eastern Front is evolving, shaped by encounters that were never planned and lessons learned under fire. When German forces resume their offensive operations in 1942, they do so against an enemy that has adapted doctrinally, industrially, and psychologically. The KV-1 is no longer a shocking surprise, but it remains a serious threat. It continues to destroy German tanks, blunt attacks, and demand disproportionate effort to defeat. And although newer Soviet designs will soon take center stage, the KV's role in breaking the illusion of German invincibility endures. It was the tank that proved armor could survive Blitzkrieg, the tank that forced an army built on speed to stop and fight, the tank that crushed German vehicles not through numbers, but through resilience. In days and weeks that Germany expected to dominate, it lost something far more valuable than steel. It lost certainty. And once that certainty was gone, the course of the war could no longer follow the path it had before. As 1942 unfolds, the KV-1 remains in service across multiple sectors of the Eastern Front, no longer a novelty but still a formidable presence. German crews now recognize its silhouette instantly. They know its strengths and, more importantly, they know their own limitations against it. Engagements become cautious, deliberate and tense, shaped by the memory of early encounters when shells bounced harmlessly away and confidence dissolved under fire. Yet familiarity does not equal dominance. In the fighting around Leningrad, KVs are used in defensive roles that suit them perfectly. Narrow roads, marshy ground and urban rubble restrict movement, neutralizing German maneuver tactics. KV tanks support infantry in close-range fighting, absorbing hits while German units struggle to bring heavy weapons forward through shell-torn terrain. In these conditions, even experienced panzer crews find themselves fighting an enemy that dictates the terms of engagement. Further south, as German forces drive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, the KV-1 appears less frequently than newer Soviet tanks, but its presence is still felt. When it does enter combat, it often anchors defensive positions or leads counterattacks intended not to break through, but to stall and disrupt. These actions force German commanders to commit resources they can ill afford to lose, particularly as the war's economic pressures begin to mount. German industry is producing tanks at an increasing pace, but the demands of a multi-front war stretch capacity thin. Fuel shortages worsen. Replacement crews arrive with less training than those lost in 1941. Mechanical wear accumulates. In this environment, every engagement with a KV becomes more costly than it would have been earlier in the war. The KV-1's reputation among German soldiers evolves into something close to professional dread. Letters and reports speak of heavy Russians that must be avoided until proper weapons arrive. Infantry units learn to dig deeper, disperse more widely, and rely on coordination rather than improvisation. These adaptations save lives, but they also slow operations and sap momentum. For Soviet forces, the lessons of the KV program continue to shape armored doctrine. Commanders learn that survivability buys time, but only if paired with reliable logistics and coordinated support. Training improves. Combined arms tactics are emphasized. Heavy tanks are integrated more carefully into operational plans rather than thrown into battle piecemeal. At the same time, Soviet designers refine their approach. The KV's armor philosophy is preserved, but its mechanical shortcomings are acknowledged. Work continues on improved transmissions, lighter variants, and more efficient layouts. The goal is not just to survive, but to fight effectively for longer periods without breakdown. These developments occur against a backdrop of industrial mobilization unlike anything Germany can match. Factories relocated east of the Urals operate around the clock. Standardization improves output. Losses that would cripple another nation are absorbed and replaced. The KV-1, though no longer the cutting edge, remains part of this larger system, one component in an industrial war of attrition. By late 1942 and into 1943, the battlefield is crowded with new machines. German heavy tanks enter service, designed explicitly to counter vehicles like the KV. Soviet medium tanks appear in vast numbers, combining protection, firepower, and mobility in ways that redefine armored warfare. In this evolving environment, the KV-1 gradually recedes from prominence. But its impact does not fade. The tank's early victories, measured not just in destroyed vehicles, but in delayed advances and disrupted plans, have already reshaped the war. They forced Germany to fight on terms it did not choose. They exposed the limits of doctrine built on speed alone. And they demonstrated that resilience, when applied at the right moment, can outweigh elegance and efficiency. In retrospect, the KV-1's greatest achievement is not the number of German tanks it destroyed, but the assumptions it shattered. It proved that the Red Army, despite its flaws, possessed the capacity to surprise, adapt, and endure. It proved that technological superiority is temporary, and that underestimating an opponent carries consequences measured in blood and steel. As the war grinds toward its brutal midpoint, the KV-1 stands as a symbol of that realization. A tank once laughed at, then feared, and finally respected. A machine that crushed German armor not through spectacle, but through persistence. And in doing so, it helped turn a lightning war into a long, grinding struggle that Germany was never prepared to win. By 1943, the war that Germany set in motion with such confidence has become something else entirely. The Eastern Front is no longer defined by rapid breakthroughs and sweeping encirclements, but by attrition, by the grinding exchange of men, machines, and material on a scale without precedent. In this transformed battlefield, the KV-1 no longer dominates headlines or intelligence summaries, yet its legacy is embedded in every armored engagement that follows. German heavy tanks now prowl the front, armed with guns powerful enough to defeat the KV and its successors. Soviet forces field newer designs in overwhelming numbers, emphasizing production efficiency and combined arms coordination. The armored war has matured, hardened by experience, shaped by adaptation on both sides. But this evolution traces directly back to the shock of 1941, when German assumptions met Soviet steel and failed. The KV-1's story is inseparable from that moment. In purely numerical terms, the KV does not decide campaigns. It does not appear in sufficient quantity to halt Barbarossa or reverse German gains outright. Many are lost to mechanical failure, air attack, or eventual destruction by heavy guns. Yet history is not shaped only by totals and tallies. It is shaped by inflection points, moments when belief gives way to doubt, when confidence yields to caution. The KV-1 is one such moment. It enters the war as an object of ridicule, dismissed by intelligence analysts and mocked by crews accustomed to technological superiority. Within days it becomes a problem, within weeks it becomes a priority, and within months it becomes a catalyst for change. German doctrine adapts, German industry shifts, German psychology hardens, not toward victory but toward survival in a war that no longer promises quick resolution. For the Soviet Union, the KV's early performance provides something equally vital: proof that their industrial choices, however crude they appear, can produce weapons capable of standing against the best the Wehrmacht can field. Proof that endurance has value in modern warfare. Proof that even in chaos, resistance matters. The men who crewed these tanks rarely left behind personal testimonies. Their names are often lost, their actions recorded only in fragments of reports and enemy accounts. Yet their impact is unmistakable. They fought in isolation, without retreat, often without support, holding roads and junctions that were never meant to be held for long. They did not win glory, they bought time. And time on the Eastern Front was everything. Every hour a KV blocked a supply route was an hour German tanks sat idle. Every day an advance was delayed pushed operations closer to winter. Every encounter that forced heavy guns forward slowed the tempo of invasion. These effects compounded quietly, invisibly, until the momentum of Blitzkrieg, so carefully engineered, began to erode. By the time Germany realized what was happening, the opportunity for a decisive victory in the East had passed. The KV-1 did not end Blitzkrieg alone, but it helped expose its limits. It demonstrated that war against an industrial power willing to absorb losses and adapt under fire could not be won through speed and audacity alone. It showed that armor, used deliberately and stubbornly, could alter the flow of operations far beyond its immediate reach. In the final accounting of the Second World War, the KV-1 occupies a unique place. It is not the most famous tank, it is not the most produced, it is not the most refined, but it is among the most consequential. It stands at the point where confidence cracked, where assumptions failed, and where a laughing enemy learned too late that resilience can be a weapon as powerful as any gun. Germany laughed at this tank. Then it fought it. And in those early days of fire and steel, as German armor burned on forest roads and supply columns stalled under an unbreakable silhouette, the course of the war began to bend, slowly, inexorably, away from the victory Germany believed was already theirs. And yet history does not turn on laughter alone, it turns on what follows after it fades. In the aftermath of the early Eastern Front battles, German analysts would catalogue the KV-1 as a tactical anomaly, dangerous but inefficient, powerful but flawed. On paper, they were not wrong. The KV was heavy, mechanically fragile, slow to manufacture, and difficult to sustain in prolonged operations. It consumed fuel at alarming rates. Its transmission failures were frequent. Many were abandoned by their own crews when recovery was impossible. But wars are not won on paper. They are won in the moments when expectations collapse, when doctrine meets reality, and when a single weapon forces an enemy to abandon the comfort of assumption. The KV-1 did exactly that. It did not need to appear everywhere. It only needed to appear where it was least expected, on a narrow road, at a river crossing, in front of a supply column moving without fear. There it did its work. The German army that entered the Soviet Union in June 1941 believed it understood armored warfare better than any force on earth. It believed speed was protection, coordination was dominance, and initiative was decisive. Against most opponents this belief held true. Against the KV-1 it faltered. not because German soldiers lacked skill or courage, but because their system had been optimized for a different kind of enemy. The KV did not play the game Germany had mastered. Instead, it imposed a different logic, one of resistance rather than maneuver, of absorption rather than evasion. It forced German units to slow down, to concentrate, to expend effort and resources far beyond what a single tank should demand. In doing so, it exposed the fragility of a strategy that depended on uninterrupted momentum. The true measure of the KV-1's success lies not in the exact number of German tanks it destroyed, though that number was real and painful, but in what it compelled Germany to do next. It compelled heavier guns, heavier tanks, more cautious advances, more deliberate planning, and each of those changes carried costs in time, fuel, training, and industrial capacity that Germany could ill afford in a long war. For the Soviet Union, the KV-1 was never meant to be elegant, it was meant to endure, and in enduring it helped the Red Army survive the most dangerous year of the war. It bought time for factories to move east, time for new doctrines to form, time for better tanks to reach the front in overwhelming numbers, time for an army that had been reeling to begin learning how to fight back. When later Soviet victories are remembered, Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, they are often associated with different machines, different commanders, different moments. But beneath those victories lies a foundation poured in 1941, when tanks like the KV stood alone and refused to yield ground that doctrine said could not be held. That is why this story matters. Because the KV-1 was not a symbol of perfection, it was a symbol of refusal, refusal to collapse, refusal to retreat when retreat was expected, refusal to conform to an enemy's understanding of how the war should be fought. Germany laughed at this tank because it did not fit their vision of modern warfare. Then it crushed 40 of theirs in days, halted advances that were supposed to be unstoppable, and forced the most experienced armored force in the world to admit, quietly, reluctantly, that the war in the East would not be quick, clean, or predictable. By the time that realization fully set in, the opportunity for an easy victory was gone. What remained was a long war of steel and endurance. And in that war, the KV-1 had already done its job. And so, when historians trace the moment Germany's Eastern gamble began to unravel, they do not look only to sweeping battles or famous turning points. They look to the quieter shocks, the unexpected resistance, the stalled columns, the reports written in confusion and disbelief. They look to the early days of Barbarossa, when certainty met something it could not easily overcome. They look to the KV-1. Because in those first brutal weeks of the invasion, when the outcome of the war still seemed fluid, this ungainly, over-armored Soviet tank imposed a cost Germany had not calculated. It delayed, it disrupted, it forced adaptation under fire, and in doing so it helped transform a campaign meant to last months into a war that would consume years. Germany laughed at this tank. Then it fought it. And by the time the laughter stopped, the future of the war had already begun to change.